Dexter Lawrence has reportedly requested a trade, but before you get your hopes up about the Packers, it does not make sense for Green Bay, and at the asking price, I'm not sure it makes sense for anybody.
You are Locked On Packers, your daily Green Bay Packers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Packers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Peter Bukowski, and I cover the Packers for The Leap, a newsletter I would love for you to subscribe to. Thanks to everyone who makes Locked On Packers their first listen every day. We hope you like starting your day with us as much as we like starting our day with you here on the Locked On Podcast Network, the #1 sports podcast network. Dexter Lawrence requests a trade. We're going to lead with that. Bob McGinn in his series at Go Long. A lot of interesting stuff in there about the corners. I want to dig into some of that. And the Packers had defensive tackle Caleb Proctor in for a 30 visit. And it is interesting to look at the size of defensive tackles the Packers have tended to like over the last handful of seasons, going back through Ted Thompson. So more than a handful of seasons. Let's start with Dexter Lawrence, though, because apparently there have been contractual issues with Lawrence in New York over the last few years. He is paid like one of the best defensive tackles in football, but not like the best defensive tackle in football. And apparently he is ready to be done with New York. Based on the early reporting around what New York would want and what Dexter Lawrence wants, because this is a contractual dispute first and foremost. So think about the Micah Parsons situation. He wanted a new deal. And ultimately, that got acrimonious because what he wanted was the contract. So let's just start there. There was reporting from SNY in New York that the contract that Dexter Lawrence is looking for is north of $30 million. In fact, well north of $30 million, something like $35 million. Right now, the top of the defensive tackle market is $31 million. That's Chris Jones. And these numbers seem like funny money, and I understand that, but just start there. There is no way I would want to pay an age 29, because this is going to be his age 29 season, nose tackle, coming off his worst season in probably 5 years, at the top of the market. Dexter Lawrence is a really damn good football player. He would make the Green Bay Packers better. Duh. No questions asked. If the Bears traded for Dexter Lawrence, I'd be annoyed. He would make the Bears better. If the Lions traded for him, if the Vikings, if the Eagles, if the 49ers, I'd be annoyed. He makes those teams better. But the cost here, especially for a Packers team that just sent 2 first-round picks for Micah Parsons, that is paying Micah Parsons at the top of the pass rusher market, this does not make sense. Just from the money standpoint, like the Packers were willing to pay Micah Parsons. Micah Parsons is younger and is one of the 2 or 3 best defensive players in the league. Dexter Lawrence, maybe 2 years ago, had a season that put him in that conversation as one of the best defensive players in this year. He has not had a sack, and I know sacks aren't everything, but he has not had a sack since October of 2024. Like, sacks are fluky, and the pass rush win numbers and some of the underlying metrics are still pretty good. But like, if you're one of the best defensive players in the NFL, if you're someone who is worth $35 million a year, you cannot go an entire season without a sack. There were questions about work ethic last year, about engagement, and I understand the Giants were not very good. And the Giants have not been very good for most of Dexter Lawrence's career in New York. And so this might be as simple as, I want out, I don't want to sit through a rebuild, and I'd like to get paid. And if the Giants are going to play hardball on cost, get me out of here. Now, the second part of the reporting we got from Jordan Raanan was that a late first, early second is considered the value. And then Connor Hughes came in on top of that and added, maybe a 2027 first round pick, which is viewed as a 26 second, or maybe a second this year and a 5th or something like that. No. not when you add in the contract you have to give the player. Because if you just trade for him, you're not going to get the most motivated version of that guy if what he wanted all along was a contract. He's going to mope. He's going to be bummed. Maybe he's not going to mope. But why would you think you're going to get a better version of the guy we saw last year, who was not the ultra elite player we've seen in the past, when what he wants is a new contract? There's 2 years left on the current deal, low 20s. He's basically making Kenny Clark money. And that's a good proxy here. Kenny Clark was viewed as a desirable piece in the Micah Parsons trade. 2 firsts and Kenny Clark was the compensation. Now, Kenny Clark, not as good a player as Dexter Lawrence. No one's going to argue that. But he was essentially a throw-in in the Micah Parsons trade. The Packers were going to cut him because of the cost. I just don't know. And look, I don't know how any team, if the cost to get him is going to be a team with either a late first round pick or an early second round pick, or it's going to be a second and stuff, and $30+ million for a nose tackle, an older player at that, who's coming off his worst. I mean, this is the type of delusion that you usually need hallucinogenic drugs to accomplish. I have no choice but to respect it. But it is bananas, bonkers, crazy. No way. No way. Again, he's a good player. The age curve at nose tackle, someone who you then want to pay at the, like, it'd be different getting, there's been plenty of examples of nose tackles playing into their early 30s and being productive players. But if you're going to give him a 3 or a 4 year contract at $30+ million, you need him to be one of the best players in the NFL. Period. And I just don't know why you would expect that to be the case. He's been a good player in the past. He plays a lot. There's a lot of mileage on that body. Guys, it's easy to be excited about it. I joked about it on social media. Brian Gutekunst is calling. But I don't see it. I don't see it. Now, that being said, he would make the Packers better. Like, they'd have the best front in the NFL if he showed up in Green Bay. Like, they'd have a killer front. Okay, they'd have one of the best fronts in the NFL. But at what price glory? You're going to just have no draft picks? The Packers need some cost-controlled guys in here somewhere. You're just going to have no draft picks and you're going to pay $70+ million to 2 defensive linemen? Like, if you could get whatever the defensive tackle version of Micah Parsons was, yeah, great, but you can't. Now, if they would take one of the Packers receivers and a mid-round pick, now let's have a conversation. Like, if you would take Dontavian Wicks and a third, now let's have a conversation. But even that, we'll talk about your contract in a year. There's still 2 years left on that deal. And then if you're the Packers, you can say, okay, here's the deal. We'll give up the draft assets. We'll make the run with you. And then you can go from there. And then in a year, you either have a trade piece that you can give, get whatever you can from him. If he has a good season and you don't want to pay the money, maybe someone else will want to. Or you just say, nah, dude, you're under contract. Like, that's the lever that whatever team has. But the whole point of this, again, getting back to my original point, the whole point of this is that he wants a new deal. So if I'm Dexter Lawrence, I'm not going to show up. Trade for me. I will not show up without a new contract. And that's the game that can be played here. So you have to want to give him the contract to start there. And I wouldn't want to do that. If he would take 25, now let's have a conversation. On a shorter year deal, but that's the thing is, are we just ripping up the current contract? Because you're under contract. Like this sort of stuff, if this is the cost and this is the value that they're expecting in return, I don't think there's a team out there that's going to give them that. I think a 3rd round pick and stuff is where I would top out, especially given what the cost is going to be. And I think Dexter Lawrence is a much better player than DK Metcalf in a vacuum. But given what the Steelers had to give up and pay, like, a receiver is a much more premium position as viewed by the NFL in terms of value. And you know who agrees? The NFL. The highest paid receivers are getting more than the highest paid nose tackles, and it's not close. I mean, it's not close. The highest paid receivers in the NFL are getting almost double what Dexter Lawrence got when he got his extension, when he was the best nose tackle in the NFL. Almost double. And I would much rather pay Christian Watson $28 million than Dexter Lawrence $28 million. And I probably want to pay Christian Watson that money. And I don't have to give up anything to get him. So it's a fun hypothetical. I am gobsmacked by what the conversation looks like right now. There's just no way I'd be in for that. All right, we're going to talk more about defensive tackles coming up, but let's talk about cornerbacks first. That's next. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. Financial stress is something a lot of people are carrying right now, and it's not just about the numbers. It can affect your sleep, your relationships, your overall mental health in ways that build up over time. And the reality is, struggling with money doesn't mean you've failed. Sometimes it just means you haven't had the right kind of support. It's something I thought about, how easy it is to put pressure on yourself financially without really talking about it because it's impolite, we're taught, to talk about money. So who do you have those conversations with? Well, maybe it's your partner. Well, your partner is probably feeling that same stress and burden, trying to figure everything out. Even if you have the chance to do it together, it can feel like a burden. Therapy isn't about financial advice. It's about working through the stress, the anxiety, and the emotions that come with it. With over 30,000 licensed therapists and more than 6 million people served, BetterHelp makes it easier to get matched and start focusing on what you need. When life feels overwhelming, therapy can help. Sign up and get 10% off at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's betterhelp.com/lockedon. And don't forget to check out the Everydayer Club for ad-free episodes and access to a group chat with me and other listeners of the show. Tap the link in the show notes or go to lockedonpackers.supercast.com for more. So I was going through the Bob McGinn piece on the corners. And the first thing that stood out to me is not who or how the list is put together, but who's not on it. My guy Julian Neal is not on this list. Now that's not the craziest thing I've ever heard. If you look at the list, they did a top, 12, and then they did 5 more. So that's 17 corners, but half a dozen of them are projected slot corners, guys like Keith Abney, Chandler Rivers, D'Angelo Pons, Keontae Scott. At least those 4 are expected. But to not have Julian Neal in the top 12 is pretty surprising. Now, another thing that stood out to me. We know the top 3 in this draft in some order. Jermon McCoy was the number 1 corner in this class, according to Bob McGinn's scouting survey. Remember, these are guys in the NFL doing the job. The Tennessee guy from, has not played football in over a year, torn ACL, but just ran fast at his pro day. The tape is good. He's going to be a first-round pick. Mansour Delane, going to be a first-round pick. Colton Hood is a borderline first-round pick. But so that's where this gets interesting. Because in the 4th spot, they have Brandon Cisse. That is not the consensus opinion. The consensus opinion is Brandon Cisse is much closer to where the Packers are picking than the first round. But the very first scout quoted in this profile says he's a first. Okay. He's also 5'11.5", 189. Right on the borderline for the Packers for size. Now, Chris Johnson, my guy. I think he's the best corner in the class. The scouts have him as the 5th best corner in the class. They have him as a borderline first-round pick. High second. One scout has him as a 3rd-round pick. So, okay. Is the NFL not as high on Chris Johnson as the draft seems to be? And by the way, we just got some reporting and some word directly from Chris Johnson in the reporting that the Packers have had multiple virtual meetings with Chris Johnson in the pre-draft process. What if he's there at 40? What if he's there at 42? Do you take some draft capital, package it, and move up for a guy that at 6 foot, 194 pounds, runs 4.41, I think has got the best instincts in the class? Just a football player. Tough, physical, the right attitude. Go listen to the Goodies Guys episode. I mean, I gushed about Chris Johnson. He's one of my favorite players in the draft. I would pound the table for Chris Johnson. If they traded up for Chris Johnson, they could draft me. No, not me, because I would be, I would think that was probably pretty cool. But they could draft Jason Hershorn. And well, I would probably think that's pretty cool too. But you guys see what I'm saying? They could do whatever. And like, I would say this is a success. Now at 6, D'Angelo Pond, 2nd-round pick. There was a whole discourse yesterday about, is he a slot corner? And don't call him a slot corner just because he's little. Guys, he's 5'8", 181 pounds. There is 0% chance the Packers are going to draft that guy. 0. Davison Igbinosun from Ohio State is 7. He's skinny. I don't know if the Packers would be that interested in him. I did not like him as much as I thought I was going to when I watched the tape. But he is a 2nd-round pick. And this is where it gets interesting. They have Avion Terrell as a borderline 2nd-round pick. So now we've got 8 corners. There's only 8 corners in the range where the Packers are likely going to want one if they want one at 52. That day 2, when the Packers are going to be sitting there in the 2nd round, hoping at 52 someone falls to them. Let's just say the 4 guys, there's 3 no doubt 1st-round picks, it seems. There's 2 borderline guys and a 2nd before we get to Davison Igbinosun. So that seems like best case scenario in terms of this list, if this list is somewhat similar to the Packers list. And I don't even know if the Packers would be in on Davison Igbinosun. Came in skinnier than we thought. And then Avion Terrell, 5'10 and a half, 185 pounds, ran in the 4.6s according to these scouts. That's not happening for the Packers. And he's seen as a late 2nd, early 3rd round pick. That's why what I have been saying all along here is that I think they could move down at 52 or be focused on the 3rd round. Now, there is a glut of players, according to these scouts, late 2nd, early 3rd. Dalen Everett from Georgia. That's sooner than I thought. That is sooner than consensus. He is higher for the scouts, and I think would be higher for the Packers than a lot of other places would have him. He's seen as a borderline 2nd, 3rd. Will Lee from Texas A&M, who we are going to do a Goodies Guys on. 6'1 and a half, 189 pounds, a little skinny, but he does not look that little to me. I think he dropped some weight to run fast and then didn't run that fast. So that's, I think, part of the question here. Then Tacario Davis, who we're also going to do a Goodies Guys on. We're going to do an Ephesians Prysock Goodies Guys as well. Both Washington corners are going to get that. That's your whole class. Everyone after that, Malik Muhammad, Devin Moore, in terms of guys that the Packers might actually draft, are seen as more like 4th round players. 12 corners in the top 100 picks. That's not very many. Now, there's a bunch of pass rushers. There's a bunch of offensive linemen. There's a bunch of receivers who are going to go. But this tells you that the meat of this class is really not at the top. So do you, if you're the Packers, move up? If you really like Chris Johnson, it seems like they're doing plenty of homework on Chris Johnson. Or do you sit there at 52, and if the defensive tackle you like or the corner you like isn't there, do you drop down a little bit, see if you can add some extra draft capital, and you take a Dalen Everett? You take a Will Lee. You take a Tacario Davis. Does it make you more interested in Davis and Igbinosun? Solid second-round pick, according to the scouts, compared to Christian Gonzalez, who's one of the best corners in the league. Another scout called him a third-round player. Not a lot of consensus in this draft around these guys. This is a weird draft class, as I've been telling you from the start. And I think the meat of this corner class is best third, fourth round. So you move back from 52, and maybe you go bang, bang. Maybe you pick up two corners right in a row. I think defensive tackle at 52, corner at the third round, corner in the fourth round for the Packers makes a ton of sense. It just may be players that we're not thinking either could be or would be available to the Packers in those spots. And now maybe more and more looking like that's where they're going to have to find value. All right, speaking of the draft, let's talk about defensive tackles, because Caleb Proctor is a fascinating player. And I'm a little surprised the Packers are in, but then again, I'm not surprised. I'll explain. The Green Bay Packers reportedly had Caleb Proctor in for, or will have Caleb Proctor in for a 30 visit. And in a vacuum, if you look at the relative athletic score, you look at the productivity, that kind of stuff, it's not a shock. 9.14 relative athletic score, 93rd percentile vertical, 91st percentile broad, ran 4.79 at 291. That's crazy. 98th percentile for defensive tackle. Now he's a little light for defensive tackle, but 291, we're talking about a guy in the fourth round. So the Packers have not drafted a guy under 300 pounds in the top 100 since Jarrell Worthy, and he was 298. And when you look at the thing about Caleb Proctor is he's 6'1" and change, almost 6'2", 291. So he's not, that 291 frame when you're less than 6'2" is carried differently. You're a thicker, denser player. We talk about density a lot with the Packers. This is something that they care about. Athleticism relative to your density, relative to your mass. This guy, for his size, is a freak. And at first I was like, I'm a little surprised. Now, just because they bring him in for a 30 does not mean they want to draft him. So they're not, in, so to speak. But with the Packers, they have been very willing to take, and maybe even prefer to take, shorter defensive tackles. Go back and look through the top 100 picks. It gets a little weirder if you include other picks, but just look at where they've spent premium draft capital. They have been fine drafting shorter players. Kenny Clark was 6'2" and change, 6'2" and a half. Devontae Wyatt was 6'2" and, 3/4. So, it's 6'2" and 7/8, almost 6'3". Montravius Adams was 6'3" and a half. Jarrell Worthy was 6'2". Mike Daniels was 6 flat and a half. Pretty good players in there too, except Worthy. Now, it does make some sense. Defensive tackle is a leverage game, but there are plenty of defensive tackles out there, 6'4", 6'5", 6'6". Defensive tackles in this draft that are 6'4", 6'5", 6'6". But in this scheme, you need interior guys who can not only hold up against the run, but can penetrate. You have to be able to create negatives in this scheme. And Caleb Proctor, who went to Southwest Louisiana, is a disruptive football player. And yeah, he's not 300 pounds, and the Packers tend to like 300-pound defensive tackles. But in the fourth round, we're having a different conversation. And that's more the range where he's being projected to go. And if you think about some of the defensive linemen that they've drafted over the years, they're more outliers in terms of athletic profile, size, those kinds of things. Just think of what the group last year looked like. Carl Brooks, not a traditional defensive tackle body type for the Packers. Kobe Wooden, not a typical defensive tackle body type for the Packers. He was playing nose tackle at 275 pounds. That's crazy. So we've seen them over the years, Brian Gutekunst, be willing to take some atypical body types on day 3. And this is someone with his athleticism that just screams Packers. And what's interesting too is, on the visits, they haven't actually brought in that many guys that we've seen reporting on, at least, that have draftable grades by the consensus. We've seen a bunch of guys who are UDFAs, but all of them are freaky athletes. All of them. And so I do wonder, this is something you look at last year. The Packers, they brought in for visits like half their draft class. They have telegraphed this in the Brian Gutekunst era. You bring a guy in, like there's a decent chance that you're going to get drafted. Not a better than 50-50, but like they consistently grab a group of guys that they drafted. Now with Ted Thompson, his 30 visits were almost always UDFA scouting. And I think the Packers are doing a lot of that in this class, but like Ted Hurst, that's a day 2 player. Caleb Proctor is a top 140 player, at least 130, 120, maybe. A first 4 rounds kind of player. They brought in a couple guys that are in that range, and it's hard to really get a handle on what they're looking at specifically. And remember, just because they bring in a guy for a visit, sometimes you are double checking, and sometimes you are crossing off. Hey, let's bring this guy in. Oh, okay. No, thank you. And you're like, maybe we should give him a second chance. And then the answer is, no, you shouldn't. No, you shouldn't. And that's okay too. So that's not to say that they're going to draft a shorter defensive tackle. But someone like Caleb Proctor, I mean, he's the kind of player that when you see the athletic tools, when you see the tape of him just like wrecking shop, now lesser level of competition, you understand why, hey, in the 4th round, this is a lot like the Carl Brooks, where like Carl Brooks just dominated everyone in front of him. When you go to a smaller school, that better be how you play. But Carl Brooks had an atypical athletic profile for any player in the NFL, like a below average athlete, period, at defensive line, whether he's a tackle or whether he's an edge. Caleb Proctor is not. And if you're going to bet on an outlier anywhere, especially someone with the disruptive pass rush ability that Caleb Proctor has shown, you want that athletic tool set, or at least I do. And so height is not really that big. Height is not a disqualifying factor on the interior. The Packers have shown that over and over and over. And so, yeah, he's short for a defensive tackle. A lot of Packers defensive tackles over the years have been short, and that includes the good ones. And Montravius Adams was not good in Green Bay, but then went on to have a very good NFL career. In fact, once he left, it was kind of like, hey, you know who the Packers could really use? Montravius Adams. So the model has worked for them. Kenny Clark, kind of right along average, but they usually like 6'5" edge defenders, 260, 270 pound edge defenders. They want size and speed on the edges. On the interior, they're like less picky about athleticism and less picky about size. Traditionally, it has been that 300-pound cutoff, but that's early. On day 3, they've drafted a lot of guys who don't fit that criteria. Guys in the 280s, guys in the 290s. And Caleb Proctor more than checks those boxes. And so he's a player who I kind of didn't consider for the Packers. And now that I see that they brought him in, I'm going, what would be really fun is Caleb Proctor. And he's similar to Devontae Wyatt and Javon Hargrave and Carl Brooks as a penetrating 3 technique kind of player. But man, are any of those players going to be on this team next year? I don't know. And it sure would be fun to see what he could do. And especially if you got a big boy, if you got a Christian Miller at 52, and then you turn around in the 4th round and you can get a disruptor like Caleb Proctor, you might have the core of your defensive line for the next, 5-8 years set. It would be fun. It would be exciting. And it just adds a wrinkle in all of this that we'll have to keep our eye on. And we'll be, of course, keeping our eye on all of it as we move through the pre-draft process. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you get podcasts. Follow me on the social medias, wherever you happen to be on social media. If you're an everydayer, why not be in the Everydayer Club? Get ad-free episodes of Locked On Packers, and of course, be in the group chat with me and Locked On Packers listeners. LockedOnPackers.supercast.com is the website to sign up, or click the link in the show notes for more. For those of you on video, we send you to the first ever 24/7 national NFL YouTube channel. And for those of you on audio, make Locked On NFL Draft your second listen. And as always, stay Locked On Packers.